Joseph Campbell was a professor of literature, comparative mythology, and religion, who lived born in 1904 and died in 1987, taught at Sarah Lawrence College in New York, which was a very progressive girls' college, women's college, when he started teaching there. And he was hired as an English teacher, but his interest had always been in literature and story in the largest possible sense. And he had, as a graduate student, actually gone to Paris to get a PhD in literature. He was looking at Arthurian romances, swords and all that good stuff. And he started discovering modern psychology, modern art, and realized how much that Eastern religion, how much all of these things reflected the same truths. And so he went back to his dissertation committee at Columbia and said, "Hey, I've got a great idea. I'm going to expand my thesis." And they looked at him and they said, "That's not how it's done." And basically said, "No, you can't do that." To which he basically answered, "Well, then I'm out of here." And that was in 1929. He got on a boat from Paris, came back, and landed 2 weeks before the stock market crash, and was out of work for 5 years. And looked up and, sort of tried to figure out what it was he wanted to do while he was a graduate student. And here he had been interested in all these things that the dissertation committee had said, "No, you can't do that." Well, what was going to keep him from doing that now? So he did a huge amount of reading the German Romantic philosophers, and he read Jung, and he read Freud, and he read the great Indian classics. He read all kinds of stuff. And he did the classic, driving across America looking for America, and ended up in California hanging out with John Steinbeck and Eddie Ricketts, who was a marine biologist, very seminal marine biologist, and spent a year going up and down the Pacific coast counting mollusks for Eddie Ricketts and looking at biology and how people are formed. Out of nowhere gets a call that there's an opening, first to teach at the high school that he had been as a student, and then at this new women's college, Sarah Lawrence. And he started teaching there, and what he realized was, he was teaching English, but what he really wanted to talk about, even when he was talking about, modern British novels or whatever, was the story beneath the myth. And so he started to teach a class called Mythology, Introduction to Mythology. And that story, he evolved it, teaching these young women who were full of questions and always asking him, what does that have to do with anything? And he started to really look at how myth, affects us, where it comes from. Looked up and started to write a book about the great hero stories, and he called it How to Read a Myth. And worked on that for about 8 years, and finally got it published in 1949 as The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And it was almost instantly popular success and an academic success, because it looked at the way that hero stories have been told around the world as long as we have records of them. They follow these same basic patterns. And you go, from somebody who's in the village compound in their normal everyday humdrum life, and something happens, they're called to an adventure, they get called out, and they go into a place where all of the rules change. They cross the threshold into what he called the forest adventurous, or the underworld. It's a place where none of the rules of society pertain. And so the hero goes through, a hero or heroine, and the book looks at both male and female heroes, looks at how they go through these trials and transformations, and then they come back, so that it's a circle. And that book has been, had a huge impact over the last 60 years. He looked at, teaching, and realized that teaching at a college was great. Went off, he was 50 years old, and trying to figure out, still figure out who he was and what he was doing. And he traveled for a year in Asia. And we have his journals from the time, which are kind of amazing. And in this year in Asia, he kept thinking about mythology and what it was, but he was also looking at all of the Americans that he was meeting and the fact that they were fairly oblivious. The diplomats, the business people, the academics even, had no idea about these cultures that they would come to. And he was angry. He would tell a story about going to Angkor Wat, which is this amazing Buddhist ruin in the jungles of Cambodia. And he had been looking forward to this trip the whole year that he had been overseas. He, had wanted to see this. It's one of the great ruins of the world, one of the great cultural landmarks. And they get there, and there's an American couple sitting with him, and the guy's complaining the whole time. They get onto the bus, and he says, "I'd have rather had a Coke and go see any of these damn ruins," And that was it. James, it set him off. He said, "I got to do something about this." And so what he did, and again, it's in the journal, which is kind of an amazing thing, is he said, "What am I going to do?" He said, "Well, I'm going to write a book here. I wrote a book about how universal myths are. I'm going to write a book about how they're different in different places." It ended up being 4 books. It's called The Mass of God. And he said, "But I need to teach places other than just colleges. I love teaching at a college, but I got to talk to other people because a lot of people need to hear this." So he started teaching. He came back from Asia and started teaching at the Foreign Services Institute, the School for Diplomats at the State Department, and so that the diplomats might have some idea of these countries that they were going to. And he also started doing lectures, public lectures, the Cooper Union. He started doing television and radio interviews, starting in New York and then around the world. And that really became his career. He started writing more and more books about sort of for a popular audience about what mythology was. And again, speaking, publishing, being interviewed. And in the late 70s, he was interviewed for a public TV show by a young journalist named Bill Moyers. And they did a couple of these interviews together, and they both enjoyed them enormously. They were very different men who were interested in a lot of the same things. And so at some point in the early 80s, Bill Moyers looked up and said, "I'd really love to do an extended interview with you." And they started a series of conversations, turned into 6 hours of a broadcast interviews that are called The Power of Myth. And it was an enormous sensation in terms of probably the most popular show PBS had ever had, at least to that point. And nobody expected it to be that. And the irony is that between the time that they wrapped the last interview and the time that the first episode aired, Joe died. He passed away. So he never got to see how people responded to these ideas. But, you know, I think knowing him indirectly as I do, I never got to meet him. But I got, you know, I've had to, you know, the opportunity over the years to read all of his, you know, journals and listen to thousands of hours of him talking. And I think he wouldn't have particularly liked the fame, but I think he would have been tickled by the fact that everybody was so blown away by these ideas, which he had been, you know, sort of trying to find a way to impart for years. And probably the best known, if you wanted to, you know, ask people who had watched it, what do you remember about the power of myth? And the phrase that everybody would remember was a piece of teaching that he had come up with from an old Indian text that was follow your bliss. That he felt was the one thing that he wanted to make sure that his own college students and that the people that he would talk to, that they really looked at what it meant to follow your bliss. So that's who Joseph Campbell was in the long form.